Get this woman out of my courtroom in cuffs if she won't sign that confession." Judge Harold Benning didn't even glance at Dorothy Mae Whitfield as the bailiff tightened the cuffs around her wrists. 63 years old, a school cafeteria worker for 31 years, and now she stood in a paper jumpsuit, being accused of stealing from children who never had enough to eat in the first place. 3 months later, the side doors of that same courtroom opened, and the men walking through them wore the uniforms of the United States military. Judge Benning had no idea those men were the boys Dorothy Whitfield had once fed in secret with her own grocery money, and they had not come back to watch her fall. They had come back to make sure she never fell again. Before any of that happened, there was just an old woman standing behind a steam table in the basement of Jefferson Elementary, ladling out mashed potatoes to children who sometimes hadn't eaten since the lunch before. Dorothy had worked that line since 1993. She had outlasted 4 principals, 2 roof replacements, and a kitchen renovation that took 11 months and left her cooking out of a trailer in the parking lot. She knew which kids only ate at school. She knew it the way a person knows their own name, without having to think about it. The boy with the same 2 shirts on rotation. The girl who hid extra rolls in her backpack on Fridays because Saturday and Sunday were a long stretch with nothing in the cabinets at home. Dorothy kept a list in her head, and over the years that list had 3 names on it that mattered more than any of the others. Malik Reeves, Isaiah Coleman. Andre Whitfield Jr., though Andre wasn't really hers, not by blood, not by any paper the county would have recognized. His mother had been a woman named Renee who worked nights and weekends, and sometimes didn't come home for 2 or 3 days at a stretch, and when Andre was 11 years old, Dorothy started finding him on her back porch some mornings before the sun came up, just sitting there, waiting for her to leave for work so he could walk with her, instead of walking the 4 miles alone. She never asked why. She just started leaving the porch light on and a thermos of coffee with too much sugar in it, the way an 11-year-old liked it, sitting on the step. Malik came into her life 2 years before that, when he was 9, caught stuffing dinner rolls into the waistband of his pants during the lunch line. The assistant principal wanted to suspend him for theft. Dorothy stood in that office and said the boy could have every roll on her tray if he was hungry enough to steal for it, and she would be the one explaining herself to God for it, not the school district. Isaiah showed up a year after that, quiet, watchful, the kind of kid who flinched when a chair scraped too loud against tile. Dorothy never learned exactly what was happening in his house. She only learned that he ate like he wasn't sure there'd be a next meal, and that by the time he was in middle school, he was sneaking back to the cafeteria after hours to help her wipe down the tables, not because anyone made him, but because it meant 20 more minutes somewhere that felt safe. None of those boys belonged to Dorothy Whitfield on paper. She had no custody, no kinship arrangement, no foster certification. What she had was a house on Bellwood Avenue with a couch that folded out, a chest freezer in the garage that she kept stocked on a cafeteria worker's salary, and a rule she never once broke in 31 years. Nobody who came through her door left hungry, and nobody who needed somewhere to sleep got turned away, paperwork or no paperwork. The county never knew the extent of it. The school never knew the extent of it. The boys themselves didn't fully understand until they were grown men how much of their survival had depended on a 63-year-old woman with arthritis in both knees and a husband, Walter, who'd passed 8 years earlier. Leaving her alone in that house with nothing but his pension and her own stubborn refusal to stop showing up for children who weren't hers. It should have stayed that way. A quiet kindness, unremarked upon, the kind no one writes down. But 3 years ago, a man named Garrett Pruitt bought up most of the blocks surrounding Bellwood Avenue, including the lots on either side of Dorothy's house, with plans for a mixed-use development that would triple the property value of everything he owned the moment hers came down. Dorothy's house, modest as it was, sat directly in the middle of his footprint, and she was the last holdout on a street where everyone else had already taken the buyout and gone. She wasn't interested in his money. She told him so to his face, twice, on her front porch, the same porch where Andre used to wait for the sun to come up. What came next took 18 months to build, though Dorothy never saw it coming until it was already closing around her. A city housing inspector named Carla Stennis began filing reports on Dorothy's property, citing code violations that had never existed before that inspector's first visit, structural issues that no contractor who later looked at the house could find any evidence of. Then came an audit, ordered through the county social services office, into the after-hours meal program Dorothy had quietly run out of her own kitchen for over a decade, feeding kids who came by after the cafeteria closed for the summer. The audit twisted what had been pure generosity into something else entirely: unauthorized food distribution, misuse of leftover school commodities, falsified donation records. None of it true. All of it filed in triplicate, signed, stamped, and sent up the chain until it landed on the desk of a judge who had, as it happened, gone to law school with Garrett Pruitt's older brother 30 years earlier and still played golf with him twice a month. Judge Harold Benning set Dorothy's bail higher than the value of the house Garrett Pruitt was trying to take from her. He looked at her paperwork, at the cafeteria worker's salary, at 63 years of an unremarkable, hard-working life, and he set bail at $40,000 on charges that, even if true, would not have called for it. Dorothy didn't have $40,000. Dorothy didn't have $4,000. She sat in county lockup for 19 days before a public defender finally got her case in front of anyone. And by then, the story the prosecution had built was already hardening into something that looked, on paper, almost believable. The morning of her arraignment, Dorothy Mae Whitfield walked into that courtroom in a paper jumpsuit 2 sizes too big, her wrists raw from the cuffs. Her hair, which she'd always kept neat under a hairnet for 31 years of shift work, now flattened on one side from sleeping on a thin mat on a concrete floor. She was 63 years old. She had never in her life been arrested for anything. She stood at the defense table because she could not afford to sit at one with real representation, and Judge Harold Benning looked down at her from the bench the way a man looks at something he has already decided is beneath his attention. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, not bothering to look up from the file in front of him, "the county has been more than patient with this situation. I'd advise you to take whatever arrangement the prosecution is offering, because I doubt very much a jury in this county is going to have much sympathy for a woman who's been stealing from school children for over a decade." Dorothy's hands, cuffed in front of her, didn't shake. "I never stole from a single child in my life, Your Honor. I fed them. That's not what the inspection reports say. That's not what the audit found." He finally looked at her, and there was nothing in his face but irritation, the look of a man who had a golf game later that afternoon and didn't care to be slowed down by an old woman's protests. "You can keep telling yourself a story, Mrs. Whitfield, or you can sign the plea agreement on the table in front of you and go home with a fine instead of a felony record. Those are your 2 options." The prosecutor, a sharp young man named Trent Aldous, who Dorothy would later learn had taken a campaign contribution from one of Garrett Pruitt's shell companies the previous spring, stood and added his own weight to it. "Your Honor, given the pattern of behavior across multiple years, the state isn't inclined to be especially generous here." The gallery, half full of reporters who'd gotten wind of a feel-good story about a cafeteria worker that had curdled into something stranger and more clickable, watched Dorothy stand there in silence. She thought about Walter, gone 8 years now, who used to tell her she had a backbone made of something the rest of the world didn't manufacture anymore. She thought about 3 boys who weren't boys anymore, who she hadn't heard from in months, because 2 of them were deployed somewhere she couldn't pronounce, and one of them was buried in law school exams. She thought about signing the paper just to make it stop, just to go home to an empty house and an empty freezer and whatever was left of a life that had been, until 18 months ago, quiet and good. She didn't sign it. "I'll see you at trial then," Benning said, already reaching for the next file on his docket, already moving on, already certain how this would end. What Judge Harold Benning did not know, what Garrett Pruitt did not know, what Trent Aldous and Carla Stennis and every single person who had built this case against Dorothy Whitfield did not know, was that 2 of those 3 boys had not, in fact, lost track of her. Malik Reeves, the boy who'd once stuffed dinner rolls into his pants, was now a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, stationed at Fort Bragg, and the moment a cousin of Dorothy's mentioned to him over the phone that Miss Dorothy's gotten herself into some kind of trouble with the county, Malik had requested emergency leave inside of 6 hours. Isaiah Coleman, the the quiet boy who used to flinch at loud noises, had grown into a judge advocate general officer, an army lawyer who'd spent the last 9 years learning exactly how systems like this one got built and exactly how they came apart. And Andre Whitfield Jr., the boy who used to wait on her porch step before sunrise, had taken her last name as his own the year he turned 18, in a courthouse with no fanfare and no audience but the two of them, because by then there was no question in either of their minds about whose family he belonged to. Andre was now a cyber warfare operations officer in the Air Force, the kind of job that didn't get talked about much at family gatherings, the kind of job that meant he understood digital records and altered timestamps and forensic data trails better than almost anyone Garrett Pruitt's people had ever had to worry about. It took the three of them 11 weeks to build what Garrett Pruitt's people had taken 18 months to construct, because Garrett Pruitt's people had been improvising a lie, and Malik, Isaiah, and Andre were dismantling one. And dismantling is always faster than building when you know exactly where to look. Isaiah filed the motions. Andre pulled the metadata. Malik, who outranked half the people in that county's judicial system by sheer force of military bearing, if nothing else, made the phone calls that got a state investigator's attention when local channels had gone conveniently quiet. The trial date arrived on a Tuesday in October, and Dorothy Whitfield walked into that courtroom expecting, for the first time in 3 months, to walk out the other side a free woman. She did not expect what actually happened, which was the courtroom doors opening 40 minutes into the proceedings, and 3 men in dress uniforms walking down the center aisle while Trent Aldous was mid-sentence, presenting what he called overwhelming documentary evidence of fraud. Judge Benning stopped him. "Counselor, who exactly are these men, and why are they interrupting my courtroom?" Isaiah Coleman didn't wait to be invited. He buttoned his uniform jacket, walked to the defense table, and set down a leather folder thick enough to make a sound when it hit the wood. "Your Honor, my name is Captain Isaiah Coleman, Judge Advocate General Corps, United States Army, and I am entering my appearance as co-counsel for the defendant, effective immediately, with the court's permission. This is highly irregular," Benning said, though something in his voice had already shifted, the irritation of before replaced with something closer to caution. "With respect, Your Honor, what's irregular is a 63-year-old woman sitting in county custody for 19 days on inspection reports that don't match the physical condition of her property, filed by an inspector who received a $41,000 payment from a shell company tied to the developer who's been trying to buy her out for 3 years. Isaiah opened the folder. "I'd like the court's permission to call witnesses." Trent Aldous was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is completely outside the scope of—" "Sit down, Counselor," Benning said, and there was something new in it now, something that sounded almost like a man trying to get ahead of a wave he could feel building behind him. "Let's hear what he's got." Andre stepped forward next, his laptop bag already open, his hands moving with the kind of practiced calm that came from doing this exact thing in rooms far more hostile than a county courtroom. "Your Honor, Captain Andre Whitfield, United States Air Force. I've spent the last 6 weeks reviewing the digital records behind the inspection reports filed against Mrs. Whitfield." He connected his laptop to the courtroom's display, and a series of file logs filled the screen, timestamps, login credentials, edit histories. Every one of these inspection reports was created or substantially altered after the date of Mrs. Whitfield's arrest, not before, despite being dated to suggest otherwise. "I can show the court the original metadata." The gallery, which had been half asleep through Trent Aldous's earlier presentation, came fully alert. Reporters who'd come expecting a quick guilty plea were suddenly sitting forward in their seats. "Inspector Stennis," Isaiah said, "is currently outside this courtroom, prepared to testify under subpoena. I'd ask the court to call her now, before she has the opportunity to coordinate with anyone else involved in this matter." Carla Stennis was brought in 15 minutes later, and it took less than 10 minutes of careful, methodical questioning from Isaiah Coleman, a man who had spent 9 years cross-examining people far more practiced at lying than a frightened municipal inspector, before she broke. She admitted to filing the false reports. She admitted to the payment, routed through 3 separate accounts before it reached her, all of it eventually traced back to a development company controlled by Garrett Pruitt. She admitted that the after-hours meal audit had been requested directly by Trent Aldis's office, not flagged through any normal county process. 6 weeks after Garrett Pruitt's initial offer on Dorothy's house had been refused for the second time. Mr. Pruitt said it would just speed things along, Stennis said, her voice cracking, tears running down a face that had gone pale and damp under the courtroom lights. He said she'd take the buyout once. She understood what kind of trouble she was looking at. He said nobody actually wanted it to go this far. Judge Benning's face had changed completely by this point, the irritation and certainty of 3 months earlier replaced by something tighter, more careful, a man recalculating in real time how exposed he himself might be. He had, after all, set an unusually high bail on unusually thin charges for a defendant represented by an overworked public defender in a case connected to a man he golfed with twice a month. None of that had been said out loud yet, but everyone in that courtroom, Dorothy included, could see the moment it occurred to him. "Your Honor," Isaiah said, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man who had been building toward this exact sentence for 11 weeks, "I'd also like to enter into evidence email correspondence between Trent Aldis's office and Garrett Pruitt's legal counsel, dated 4 days before this prosecution was formally filed, in which Mr. Pruitt's attorney references, and I'm quoting directly, getting the cafeteria situation handled so we can move forward with acquisition before the end of the quarter." The courtroom erupted. Benning slammed his gavel, called for order, and got none of it for nearly a full minute. Trent Aldis stood frozen at the prosecution table, the color draining out of his face as fast as it had drained out of Carla Stennis's. Dorothy Whitfield, sitting at the defense table in a paper jumpsuit that had replaced her cafeteria uniform, sat very still through all of it, her cuffed hands folded in her lap, and watched 20 years of quiet kindness come back around to save her in a way she never could have planned and never would have asked for. A side door opened, and a woman in a sharp gray suit walked in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers who weren't from the county sheriff's department. "Your Honor, I'm Special Investigator Renata Cho, State Office of Judicial Conduct. I need to address the court regarding a conflict of interest in this proceeding." Benning's hands tightened visibly on the edge of the bench. "Miss Cho, this is my courtroom, and I'll thank you too. Judge Benning," she said, her voice level and unbothered by his tone. "You've golfed with Garrett Pruitt's brother on at least 11 occasions in the last 14 months, according to club records subpoenaed yesterday afternoon. You set bail on this case $40,000 above the standard guideline range for these charges. I'm formally requesting you recuse yourself from this matter, pending a full review." "This is outrageous," Benning said, but his voice had lost its weight entirely. The bench no longer the throne it had been 3 months earlier when he barely glanced up to sentence a woman to 19 days in county lockup. "I have presided over this courtroom for 22 years, and you'll be presiding over the next 40 minutes of this hearing from the gallery, Your Honor, while we resolve the procedural irregularities," Renata Cho said. "Or I can have these officers escort you out, and we can discuss it through formal channels. Your choice." He stepped down. There was no dramatic confrontation after that, no final outburst, just a man in black robes walking off a bench he no longer had any authority over, while the courtroom watched in a silence heavier than any noise could have been. A visiting judge, a woman named Patricia Rinaldo, who'd been waiting in chambers for exactly this possibility, took the bench within minutes, reviewed the morning's filings with the kind of careful attention Benning had never bothered to give them, and, within the hour, had dismissed every charge against Dorothy May Whitfield with prejudice, voided the inspection reports entirely, and ordered an immediate investigation into Trent Aldis's office, Garrett Pruitt's development company, and the 18 months of manufactured evidence that had nearly cost a 63-year-old cafeteria worker her home, her freedom, and the only life she'd ever built for herself. The bailiff approached the defense table with his keys, and the cuffs that had been on Dorothy's wrists for most of 3 months clicked open and fell away. Malik Reeves, who had been standing at the back of the courtroom through the entire hearing, close enough to watch but far enough to let Isaiah and Andre do the work they'd trained their whole careers for, finally crossed the room and knelt down beside her chair, the way he used to kneel beside the cafeteria steam table as a 9-year-old boy, hoping nobody would notice him taking an extra roll. "Miss Dorothy," he said, and his voice, which had given orders to soldiers under far worse circumstances than this one, came out unsteady in a way none of his men had ever heard it. "We got you." She put her hand, still red at the wrists from the cuffs, against the side of his face, the way she used to do when he was small and scared and pretending not to be either. "I know you did, baby. I never doubted it for a second." The months that followed unwound the rest of it. Garrett Pruitt's development company had its permits frozen across the county within 2 weeks. The result of an investigation that, once started, found far more than just Dorothy Whitfield's case sitting at the bottom of it. 3 other longtime homeowners on streets Pruitt had been quietly assembling for acquisition came forward once they understood what had happened to her, each with their own version of inflated code violations and sudden, unexplained inspections. Trent Aldous resigned from the prosecutor's office before the state bar could finish its inquiry into the campaign contributions and the timeline of the case against Dorothy. Carla Stennis, who cooperated fully once she understood the scale of what she'd been a part of, avoided prison but lost her position and her license. The $41,000 payment that had set the whole thing in motion seized as part of the restitution order. Judge Harold Benning never returned to the bench. The judicial conduct review that followed turned up a pattern far older and wider than anyone in that courtroom, on the day of the trial, could have guessed. A man who had been quietly favoring certain interests for the better part of a decade, and he resigned rather than face the formal proceedings that would have followed. Dorothy Whitfield's house on Bellwood Avenue was repaired not by the county that had nearly taken it from her, but by a contractor Malik hired out of his own pocket and refused, despite every argument she made, to let her pay back. The porch where Andre used to wait before sunrise was rebuilt wider and sturdier than before. With a new railing and a swing he installed himself the weekend he came home on leave, working with his hands the way he used to watch her work in that cafeteria kitchen, quietly, without needing to be thanked for it. On a Saturday morning in late spring, almost a year to the day after Garrett Pruitt first knocked on her door with a buyout offer she had no interest in taking, Dorothy Mae Whitfield stood on that porch in a yellow dress with small white flowers on it, watching her yard fill up with people. Former students, now grown, some with children of their own, who remembered exactly which lunch lady had quietly made sure they never went hungry. Neighbors who'd watched the whole ordeal unfold on the local news and shown up anyway, the way good neighbors do, to stand on a porch and bear witness to something being made right. Malik stood to her left in his dress uniform, the eagles on his shoulders catching the morning light. Isaiah stood to her right, a folder under his arm out of old habit, though there was nothing left to fight for today. Andre stood slightly behind them both, his phone out, recording the moment the way he'd once recorded the digital evidence that set her free, because some things deserve to be kept. A banner stretched between 2 oak trees in her front yard read, in letters someone from the school district's art department had spent a whole weekend painting. The Dorothy Whitfield Children's Nutrition Fund, established in her name, to make sure that no child in that county ever again had to depend on the quiet, unpaid kindness of one woman with a chest freezer in her garage, and a rule she refused to break. She looked out at all of them, at the 3 men who had once been hungry boys with nowhere else to go, now standing tall enough to block out the sun behind them, and she thought about Walter, gone 8 years, who always told her that kindness given freely never really disappeared, it just went somewhere and waited. 20 years she had waited, never once expecting to be paid back, never once doing any of it for that reason. But it had come back to her anyway, in dress uniforms and leather folders, and a porch swing built by careful hands, and she understood now, standing in her own front yard surrounded by everyone she had quietly loved without asking for anything in return, that some debts the world keeps better track of than the people who give without counting ever could.